with plenty of clear spells here. Highs of 17. Showers in the south will ease tonight, leaving most places dry in the early hours. Chilly tonight, particularly in the countryside. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain every Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m. A news hour that comes with a trigger warning. Scorching hot opinion with prominent guests saying the unsayable and a little bit of weekend fun thrown in. Unlike other broadcasters, I won't be forgetting what the B in our name stands for. So howie in for Real Britain Saturday and Sunday from 2 p.m.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon. I'm Ray Addison in the GB newsroom. The Transport Secretary has warned the country's biggest rail union that holding strikes this week would be a huge act of self-harm. Thousands of rail workers will walk out on Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday, and Grant Shapps says the RMT has ignored requests to negotiate a resolution. The union claims its members have effectively taken a 20% pay cut amid rising inflation. Labour says the government wants the strikes to go ahead to stoke up political divisions. RMT's former Assistant General Secretary, Steve Headley, told GB News he agrees with Labour.
They want a distraction from soaring fuel prices, from the cost of living crisis, and they want to take on the unions. It's a great distraction. It's red meat for the Tory voters. They rally the party faithful. So I think they do, and I think this strike's really avoidable. I think we should be still around the negotiating table, but rather than negotiate in good faith with the unions, Shapps seems more interested in the latest soundbite in the press.
Meanwhile, rail union leaders say they're seeking urgent talks with the Transport Secretary amid rumours of mass ticket office closures in England from September. The Transport Salaried Staffs Association described the plans, which were reported in the Sunday Times, as explosive. The union says moving to online-only sales would badly impact millions of elderly and disabled people. The Rail Delivery Group, which represents train companies, says no decision has been made. The Labour leader says the Tories are hoarding power in the capital, which is directly linked to the cost of living crisis. Speaking in Coventry, Sir Keir Starmer warned the government's levelling up plans will fail if they don't devolve power outside of Whitehall. Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove has previously said it's essential to address the UK's regional inequalities. Sir Keir says a Labour government would ensure that councils have more stable income.
Hoarding power has consequences. The Tory economic record is terrible. Low growth for 12 years. Stagnant wages. And the reason for this is we're not making the most of every part of our country. We're squandering the potential in our towns, in our cities, in our coastal areas and our rural communities. All the places that you represent. We're squandering the potential.
The new head of the British Army warns his troops must prepare to fight in Europe as the war continues in Ukraine. General Sir Patrick Sanders says it's imperative to build an army that's capable of fighting against Russia. After returning from his trip to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, yesterday, the Prime Minister said we need to steel ourselves for a long war. And in breaking news, swimming's world governing body has voted to ban transgender athletes who've gone through male puberty from racing in women's events. Instead, open categories will be created for them to participate. The sport's new gender inclusion policy was passed by more than 70% of member federations. The rules will only apply to athletes who transitioned after the age of 12. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Back at the top of the hour.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry and clear for many, but there could be a few showers in southern England. Let's take a look at the details. It will be cloudy to end the day across southwest England. There could be spots of rain as showers push in from the Channel. Skies will also be cloudy to end the day in southeast England. There could be spots of light rain here and there, but it should stay dry for most. It should also be a dry end to the day in Wales, with largely clear skies here. It will turn chilly after the sun sets, highs of 19 degrees. Patchy cloud will push into the Midlands this evening, but it will stay dry across the region. Skies will clear later, and it will be chilly in the countryside. Staying mostly dry across northern England, but a brisk coastal wind will push a few showers towards the northeast. Highs of 19 here as well. It will be clear skies across Scotland this evening, breezy around the coastline, but lighter winds inland. Turning chilly tonight with lows of 2 degrees. It will be a dry end to the day in Northern Ireland with plenty of clear spells here. Lows of 13 and highs of 17 degrees. Showers in the south will ease tonight, leaving most places dry in the early hours. Chilly tonight, particularly in the countryside. That's how the weather's shaping up overnight.
Good morning. You're watching and listening to GB News, and this is The Political Correction. I'm Deanna Davison, and today I'm joined by Paul Embry in Norfolk and in Northern Ireland by Arlene Foster. We are here as ever for the next 2 hours to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge. This is not about journalists talking to journalists. It's about you telling us what you think. Coming up this hour, we're talking about the government's Rwanda asylum plan after a dramatic last-minute ruling by the European Court of Human Rights cancelled the inaugural flight on Tuesday night. A march organised by the Trade Union Congress took place in London yesterday as the group called for a pay rise for public sector workers and a £15 minimum wage. We discussed whether the day was a success. We're also talking about Scottish independence after First Minister Nicola Sturgeon unveiled what she called a refreshed case for another referendum. And as always, we want to hear from you this morning. And with rail strikes set to happen this week, we're asking how much they will affect you in your day-to-day life. Let us know. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at gbnews. This is The Political Correction. Home Secretary Priti Patel has told MPs that the government remains committed to sending asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda. It comes after an intervention from the European Court of Human Rights, which led to the first flight being cancelled just minutes before takeoff this week. The Rwanda asylum plan, which was announced in April, intends to take some asylum seekers who arrive in the UK on a one-way ticket to Rwanda to claim asylum there instead. So, Arlene, I'm going to start with you here. What did you make of this last-minute intervention from the European Court of Human Rights?
Well, first of all, what did I make? The government must have been completely frustrated. They had set out their plan, they had made arrangements, and then to be stopped at the very last minute by, I think it's called a Section 39 interim order from Strasbourg must have been so frustrating for them, I have to say. I mean, there is, and I was reading Priti Patel's article in the Daily Telegraph this morning, she's given an interview where she says there is an element of racism in the attacks that are coming from the left and indeed from other institutions that should know better, because there have been plans before with this policy, but there hasn't been the hyperbole that we've heard over this policy. And indeed, I was glad also to see a government spokesperson for Rwanda itself speak out and say, look, how dare you criticise our country? If you want to criticise our country, come and see it, but don't do it from afar. So I think government are now looking at a Bill of Rights, a domestic Bill of Rights to replace the Human Rights Act. I think that's good. But the question is, will that replace the ability for this Section 39 interim order to come in? Because, of course, it's international law. So they have to be very careful that when they're drafting the new bill, that it deals with the possibility of Strasbourg putting their oar in at the very last minute.
Absolutely. And Paul, I want to come back to that point there that Arlie made about the Rwandan government sort of hitting back, because we've discussed this on the show before, that, you know, if asylum seekers were being sent to, I don't know, the Netherlands or Sweden or something, it feels like there'd be much less uproar, doesn't it?
I think that's probably true, actually. I think Priti Patel used the example of Sydney and New York, and I think in those circumstances the protests would probably be a bit more muted. There does seem to be some kind of unconscious racism in the idea of people saying you shouldn't send people to this African hellhole almost. Perhaps not realising the implications of what they're saying. I mean, on the point about Strasbourg, I think it is actually quite disturbing that you can have a situation where two national courts in the UK, the High Court and the Court of Appeal, both saw no legitimate reason to intervene at that stage and to grant interim relief to the claimants, and effectively said that, you know, this flight could go ahead. And then what appears to be the on-duty judge in Strasbourg at the last minute steps in and says, no, we are going to stop that from happening. And effectively, for the time being at least, to stop an elected government carrying out its policy. And if it is the case that the European Convention on Human Rights does allow that sort of thing, then it seems to me that the writ is running too large. And I think there's another potential dispute further down the line. You know, in terms of the wider policy, because obviously we know that the High Court has said the legalities of the policy need to be reviewed, and I think that review will take place in July. What happens then if the High Court and possibly the Court of Appeal again both say, actually, this policy is okay legally, there's no reason to stop it from being implemented, and the European Court of Human Rights again intervenes, which I think it has the potential to do, and says, well, actually, no, the wider policy is not consistent with the European Convention of Human Rights, then I think we're into a real dispute about who wields power and whether or not a government can be allowed to implement its policy that you know, it's got a big decisive majority, and it was elected to govern. Now, I've got misgivings about the Rwanda policy. I think many people have. But the idea, I think, that unelected European judges can intervene in this way, I think, is quite disturbing.
I think there's been a lot of feedback sort of saying the same. I think there's been some quite lazy comments saying that now that we're out of the EU, this shouldn't be happening. I think there's been confusion over the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, which are two very different things. But there have been calls for us to potentially look at removing ourselves from the European Convention on Human Rights and thus from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. But Arlene, am I not right in thinking that there would be potential implications for the Belfast Agreement if that was done?
Yes, and indeed Dan Hannan makes that point today. He's basically saying that there's only one reason to stay in the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's the fact that it is specifically mentioned in the Belfast Agreement. Unlike a whole rake of other things that are not mentioned in the Belfast Agreement, but which people say are there, it is actually in the Belfast Agreement. And look, I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater here, but I think we do need to have a look at this in a sensible and reasonable way, because I think what you're seeing is judicial activism in the European Court of Human Rights. That's not surprising, given their role, and of course, given the role of judges in other parts of Europe, which is different from the UK. And I think people need to understand that, because judges have a different role in the Constitution. They have a different role in their countries. They take into account cultural norms in different countries, and of course, we may have different cultural norms here in the UK. So, is there a need to look at all of these things? Yes, there is, but I don't think we should rush to just throw everything out. And I also have to say this, though, I think people are saying if we left the European Convention on Human Rights that the UK would be in some way not, we wouldn't have any human rights here in the UK. Well, I mean, that's a nonsense, because we're not given human rights by the European Court of Human Rights. It just has a judicial oversight of them. We have human rights here in the UK. We're probably one of the best countries in the world for human rights and for the protection of human rights. So I think people just need to calm down, look at it rationally, look at it reasonably. There is a problem, and we need to have a good conversation about that.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, I want to come to you to talk about sort of Labour's position on this policy, because it seemed to take Keir Starmer a very long time to finally come out with an opinion, and that opinion was if Labour get into power, they'd scrap the policy. But I know we've spoken before about the kind of lack of alternative that's being proposed by the Labour Party. Have you any idea what their plan is?
No, and the truth is, Deanna, that, look, most people, I think, on the left nowadays are pro-open borders. That's the truth of it. Very much a different position to, 20 or 30 years ago, when people on the left, socialists and trade unionists like myself, believed that regulation of the labour supply and proper border control was essential. Not least so governments can plan around welfare, employment, housing, make sure there isn't undue pressure on wages in certain sectors, and so on and so forth. That position of open borders, once upon a time, was only held by Trotskyists, anarchists, and hyper-liberals. Now it's very much a mainstream position on the left, and to hold the position of control of the labour supply is almost like a fringe position. So I think many people on the left in the labour movement are quite happy to have an open borders position. But the problem is they're articulating it in bad faith, because they don't say openly, this is our position. They don't say openly, we support open borders, we think everybody should be able to come. So what they will do is they will resist particular policies or particular proposed solutions every time one is proposed. Without actually saying, well, we're going to oppose everything because we're really pro-open borders. And I was struck by a protest that was taking place at Gatwick Airport at the detention centre last week, I think it was, where the protesters were basically saying no nations, no borders, no deportations. And that occasionally, the mask slips, and that really is the position. The problem for Labour, of course, is if they said, we're pro-open borders, they know that it wouldn't be popular in terms of mainstream opinion in this country. So there's a dishonesty on the left, and it really frustrates me as somebody on the left about this debate, because so much of it, I think, is taking place in bad faith.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's this point, isn't there, that it is OK to criticise and critique a policy, but if you want to be the party of government, you have to be able to present some kind of alternative, don't you?
Well, the reality is this: having a situation where thousands of people, mainly young men, are turning up on our shores undocumented every month is simply not sustainable. Now, you can be compassionate, you can want to hold the hand out of solidarity to people who are trying to make a better life for themselves. I understand that. I'm pro-immigration. I think Britain should take its fair share of refugees, but you simply cannot have this situation going on and on and on. It has to stop. You have to break the business model. You have to break the incentive for people to make those dangerous journeys across the channel. And in the absence of anybody proposing any better solutions, then I think what the government has proposed deserves at least to be listened to. I mean, I'm in favour of offshoring for processing reasons. I think if people have their asylum claims validated, then I think we should take those people into our own country. But look, if you're not prepared to put a solution, then it undermines your own argument. You can't really expect people to take you seriously.
Mm-hmm. Well, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you made of the fact that the flight was grounded. Do you think Priti Patel is pursuing the right policy? Send us your thoughts on gbviews@gbnews.uk. Now, Boris Johnson's ethics advisor resigned on Wednesday evening, saying the Prime Minister forced him into an impossible and odious position. It came a day after Lord Geidt had said there was a legitimate question about whether the PM had broken ministerial rules over Partygate. After officially stepping down from his post, Geidt admitted his resignation letter may have been too cautious, saying the language used may have failed to adequately explain the far wider scope of his resignation. Paul, did you read the letter that Geidt put out? And if so, it was very waffly, wasn't it?
It was, and I think there's been quite a lot of confusion over the real reasons why he resigned. I think the government tried to spin it one way and Geidt tried to spin it another way. I mean, I think from what I can gather, he was asked to provide political cover for a potential breach of international law, and he said he didn't want to do that. He wasn't happy at doing that, and okay, fair enough. He's entitled to step down, which is his prerogative. I suspect one or two people might be fairly surprised at the fact that Boris Johnson had an ethics advisor in the first place, to be honest. But look, most people will not have heard of Lord Geidt, let's be blunt. Most people before this story broke would not have even known him if they passed him in the street. So in that sense, I guess it's not a huge story, but what I think it does do is it does add to that general perception of a lack of integrity within Downing Street, a lack of playing by the rules that everybody else is expected to play by. So for that reason alone, regardless of the merits of his resignation and the rights and wrongs of it, I think in terms of PR, it's clearly not very good for Boris Johnson and Number 10.
Mm-hmm. Arlene, I want to come to you on this because there are some who are saying this is another massive blow for Boris Johnson, but is this another one of those stories that really kind of captured the imagination of the sort of Westminster news bubble but didn't really hit anywhere else?
Well, yes, because as Paul says, not very many people know who Lord Geidt is. And therefore it is a bit of a Westminster bubble story. I mean, this position of government advisor on ethics was something that was created back in the Blair administration, I understand, about 2006. So it's really a new phenomenon in terms of government. The question is it really needed? Should the permanent secretary, your permanent secretary, not be advising you on whether something is right or wrong in terms of ethics? And why do we have yet another layer of bureaucracy in government? I don't think there's really a need for a specific person to be an ethics advisor. If you have to get advice on ethics, there are plenty of people within the higher echelons of the civil service who are there to give that sort of advice. So it'll be interesting to see now what happens. I think what's more damaging is the fact that two of these advisors have resigned during Boris's time. So to lose one would be a misfortune. To lose two looks like carelessness. And it is something that he will have to reflect on. But, the government advisor on ethics, as I understand it, doesn't really have any teeth. He's only there to advise on whether something is ethical or not. And the fact that he decided to go over steel tariffs on Chinese steel was rather bizarre for a lot of people. Why did he not resign over the other issues that were there? And frankly, it looks as if he just didn't want to be seen to be the man who put the final knife in Diana. So it's all a bit of a Westminster story, I'm afraid. But what will be interesting to see is what happens now to the position of government ethics advice.
Well, let's talk about a story that is less a Westminster bubble story, sticking on the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister's faced critique this week over the fact that he was supposedly due to speak at a Northern Research Group conference and then actually didn't speak at the conference because he was visiting Ukraine to give his support to President Zelensky. Paul, what do you make of this? Because it strikes me once again that there's noisy people on both sides of it, but actually most rational people have said the Prime Minister's probably right to be doing this international crisis sort of management.
It just worries me the extent to which we are getting involved in terms of Ukraine. I mean, the Russian invasion is wrong, unquestionably, and we're right to be part of the international voices speaking up against it. But it seems to me that Boris Johnson and the government are making an awful lot of commitments to Ukraine, and I just don't know that we're in a position to make those sorts of commitments, to be honest, Deanna. I mean, the British government has effectively said to Ukraine recently that we will support you to such a degree where we will guarantee your safety permanently in order to prevent any future invasion. Now, that seems to me to be a colossal commitment. And when you look at some of the difficulties we're experiencing in our own country in terms of the economy, when you look at the fact that our own armed services over the last 20 years have been pretty much stripped to the bone, I don't know that we're in a position to be able to make those sorts of long-term commitments. And, you know, it seems to me, actually, that there's a distinct lack of voices in senior positions in public life across the world who are actually making the case for peace. I'm hearing an awful lot of voices making the case for more war and more arms and more fighting. There don't seem to be many people saying, look, we need to get the sides around the table. We need a negotiated settlement. What are the United Nations doing at the moment? As far as I can see, they just haven't intervened at all, and they're proving themselves to be not worth very much. I mean, it was interesting to me that His Holiness the Pope a few weeks ago did speak out and said, look, we need to examine the root causes of this conflict perhaps a little bit more, and we do need to strive towards peace. But his remarks were kind of not particularly covered by the media here or elsewhere, I don't think. So this is a serious business. People are dying. Thousands of people have died in this conflict, and we need people to pursue the case for peace more than is happening at the moment, to be blunt.
Mm-hmm. So, Arlene, just going back to that point there about the kind of Prime Minister's role in the Ukraine conflict, and yet he's getting critique for pulling out of this Northern Research Group conference, saying that clearly it shows he doesn't care about the North, some of the things that are coming out there. As First Minister, you'll have had to kind of prioritise and try and juggle all these different, sometimes very major issues. Do you think the Prime Minister made the right call on this?
Well, I do think he made the right call. I think showing leadership in the way that he has strengthened him. And it's interesting today to see that there's an international poll, Deanna, that has come out to say that Boris Johnson globally is the man that people are identifying as giving the lead against the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I think that is important. I thought it was very telling, the difference between the photograph of Boris Johnson with Volodymyr Zelensky and the photograph of Macron with Zelensky. My goodness, if you're looking for a visual aid on knowing the difference between the two, it was there. Look, I used to hate having to cancel events at the last minute. It is really frustrating for the organisers of the event that you're not going to. It is something that I hated to do because I like to keep my promises to people. When you agree to go to address an organisation or a conference, it's important that you're there because you're given the keynote speech. But the way in which these visits happen to particularly war zones will mean that he wouldn't have known until the very last minute that it was going to go ahead. And if something had have happened that he wasn't able to go, then he would have been with the NRG. And the reality is he has been, as you will know, Deanna, been to the north of England quite a lot recently. And it's not that he's avoiding going up there. So I do have a lot of sympathy for the decisions that had to be taken at the very last minute. But no doubt, I also feel for the organisers of the conference who thought the PM were coming up to address them.
Yeah. Well, send us your thoughts. As always, we want to hear from you. Did the PM make the right decision by going to Ukraine? Should he have been at the Northern Research Group conference? Could he have done both? Send us your views on GBViews at gbnews.uk. And coming up after the break, we're talking about the We Demand Better March, which took place in London yesterday. But as always, we want to hear from you. We've got rail strikes happening this coming week, and we want to know, how do you feel they're going to affect you? Are you worried about getting to hospital appointments, to exams, or just getting into work? Let us know. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet us at gbnews. See you after the break.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
We're winning in places where we need to win if we're going to win a general election. Look at Cumberland. I know it's a new authority, but sitting below Cumberland, behind Cumberland, is Copeland, Workington and Carlisle. 3 seats that we need to win. Rosendale up in Lancashire, same story. Kirklees. And go to the other end of the country, Southampton, Worthing, and of course, most recently, Crawley. Showing that coast to coast across the country and the seats that we need to win, we can win and we will win.
Well, that is Keir Starmer there, who is currently giving a speech in Warwick at local Labour government conference. Apparently, later in his speech, he's due to accuse the Tories of hoarding power in Westminster while squandering the potential of the rest of the country. So, Paul, I want to talk to you about this. This is a big opportunity for Starmer to talk to councillors, some of his big activist base, and to really sort of set out his stall. It sounds like he's going to talk a lot about levelling up and devolution and be quite critical of the government. Is that the right approach, do you think, or do you think he's slightly missing the tone of the big issues that his membership and indeed his voters care about?
Levelling up for me is about having a plan, about having a vision, about having a clear economic vision of how you want to rebalance the economy, how you want to reduce the gap between rich and poor, how you're going to tackle regional inequalities, boardroom excesses, how you're going to get real wages rising. It's about much more than simply moving a Whitehall department to the north or introducing free ports and stuff like that. And to be honest, then I don't think either party has necessarily grasped that at the moment. I think if you said to either party, like, how are we going to revive our industrial base, for example? How are we going to rehabilitate manufacturing in this country? How are we going to restore some of those thousands of blue-collar jobs and industries that we've lost overseas in recent years? How are we going to make ourselves more competitive? How are we going to get productivity and investment up? How are we going to build the houses that people need in this country? And it seems to me that neither party has really got the solutions. And until, frankly, the Labour Party comes up with a vision for that sort of thing that really resonates with the concerns of ordinary working class people, then it would be very complacent to assume it's going to win the next election. You cannot just rely on the Tories failing. You cannot just rely on the Tories becoming unpopular. You have to have a bold vision economically and also in terms of culturally closing that cultural gap that has opened up widely between the Labour Party and working class communities in recent years. Those are the 2 points of focus I think the Labour Party needs to adopt. And I don't see much progress on either of them at the moment.
And Arlene, I want to talk about these sort of major conferences because they're often seen as real pivotal moments in leadership. But actually, you know, from your experience as First Minister of speaking at such conferences, do they make much of a difference?
Well, sometimes for those of us looking in at conferences, they can seem pretty dull. And I have to say that sounded pretty dull because, of course, what he was doing there at the start of his speech was reaching out to the different parts of his party and saying, oh, well done to X and well done to Y. And we've taken the council and we only had one councillor there in the past. And so he's really trying to talk to his members. Meanwhile, all of the press are there looking for the little bit of a speech that's going to have relevance to the wider public. And of course, that has been already trailed because he's talking about levelling up and he's talking about the fact that the Tories aren't going to deliver on levelling up. But actually, the Tories have the power to deliver levelling up, as you know, Diana, because in the Internal Market Act that has now been in place for I think it was 2019, although I stand to be corrected on that. They have the power to act even in devolved administrations if they believe that they can act in a way which would be good for the citizens of that area. So they can act in Scotland, they can act in Northern Ireland and in Wales, and indeed right across England. So they need to use those powers. They need to identify, as Paul says, where the gaps are, what do we need to do, what intervention is needed to help that particular area. Because I always go back to the fact that if the union is to mean anything, the union of the United Kingdom is the union has to work for all parts. No matter where you live in the United Kingdom, you should be able to have the same access to services and be economically viable as any other part of the union. So that's why levelling up is important. I know it's a vision, but we need to start implementing the vision now and to see it making a real difference right across the UK.
Well, this was in response to Keir Starmer's speech, which is going on right now in Warwick at the Labour Local Government Conference. We may dip back into it in a little while, so don't go anywhere. But first, we are going to talk about protests because yesterday, thousands of people gathered in London to take part in a cost of living march organised by the Trade Union Congress. Speaking about the We Demand Better march, the TUC said that working people have had enough, adding, we need help with energy bills and a real pay rise for every worker. Paul, we know that you are a good trade union man and you love a good protest. So why weren't you there yesterday?
Well, I must say I've been on hundreds of these protests in the past and I've done my bit, but I was under strict instructions from my wife yesterday to carry out a list of domestic duties. So it was either miss the march or have divorce papers served upon me. So I decided to go for the former. But it was a good march, I think. I think it was very much needed. As I've argued on the programme before, I think there are millions of workers in this country who are sick and tired of being told that they constantly have to pay the price for economic crises that were not of their making. First of all, the global financial crisis in 2008, and frankly, we're still suffering the reverberations of that even now, and more recently, the cost of living crisis too. And in a situation where real wages continue to fall, in a situation where people especially with the recent interest rate rise, are likely to be struggling to pay their mortgages, problems with fuel bills, people suffering from insecure transient employment, people struggling to get on the housing ladder. I think the message from the TUC March, and it's an absolutely right message, is that this economy is not working for millions of people. And frankly, we need radical intervention. We need a radical reordering of the economy so that people aren't going to suffer in the way that they would otherwise suffer. And the thing is, Deanna, what frustrates people as well is directors' pay always seems to be secured. I mean, executive pay has raced ahead of the average worker's pay over recent years. And some people, as we know, did very nicely out of the pandemic. And the gap between rich and poor in this country seems to me to be as wide as ever and increasing still. So the message from the march needs to be taken seriously, because I think many people have had enough.
You talk about directors' pay. I could make the point about trade union leadership pay there, couldn't I? Because they tend to be on a pretty good salary compared to a lot of their members too. But there's a question I want to ask Paul, and this is about the actual kind of purpose of marches, because ideally the purpose is to try and influence policy or political decisions in the way in which the people on the march want, right? But I get very confused with the messaging, because this march was supposed to be about pay and kind of work standards. And so there were placards that said, if our pay doesn't rise, we will. But then other placards saying, kick the Tories out, nurses not nukes, support the rail workers' strike, end racism at work now, free Assange. I mean, do you find that you get these sort of militant lefties who all come along to have their say and get involved just for the fun of it? And do you think that then dilutes the message for kind of the public and for the politicians who they're supposed to be trying to influence?
Well, as I say, I mean, I've been on many, many marches of this kind over the last 30 years, and you will always get hangers-on. You will always get activists from disparate, particularly far-left groups, in some cases anarchists, in some cases revolutionaries, in some cases communists, who will, and frankly, the members of the public, they're as entitled to join the march as much as anybody, and, they will tag on to the march, and they will often have their own themes and their own messages. It's impossible, frankly, to police that. When you're marching along a public highway, then really you can't stop who joins you. But what I would say to people is, look, of the thousands of people there yesterday, the vast majority would consider themselves to be part of the mainstream. What they're arguing for is a pay rise, frankly. That's the number one message. We're fed up with having to pay the price of economic crisis, both in the past and now. Our real wages are going through the floor, our living standards are crashing, and the government is not doing enough to rectify that situation. That is the ordinary message from most marchers there yesterday, and I really think that will resonate much more widely across the country.
Well, let's stick on this theme, Arlene, because this week it looks as though there are going to be some pretty vast rail strikes, which are going to have an impact on thousands, if not millions of people around the country. But we've heard trade union leaders now saying that they think there could be much broader strikes over the summer, a sort of summer of discontent, as it's been dubbed. Do you think that the trade unions are kind of justified in this, particularly given it tends to be about pay, against the backdrop of the really difficult economic circumstances we face because of COVID?
Well, there's a number of things, Deanna, and first of all, it's good to see where the division of labour is in the Embry household. I'm delighted to see that. But in terms of what's happening and what looks as if it's coming down the road at us all, it looks as if the unions have been saving up for this big push against the Tory government. And it looks as if they're coordinating. When I see posters from Unite the Union advertising how much people can get when they're on strike, and that has increased to £70 per day now. So in other words, if you go on strike, you're going to be able to get £70 a day. So don't worry about going on strike. And it worries me, Deanna, because this is all under the banner of standing up for workers' rights. But there are many workers who aren't going to be able to get to their work now next week. They're going to have to stay at home if they can. Many of us will still have to travel, of course, for our work. And never mind that, what about medical appointments? What about those children who are sitting critical exams, their A-levels, their end-of-term exams? So I think they're punishing, and I do echo Grant Shapps in this, they are punishing millions of workers right across the United Kingdom. I think it's shameful.
Yeah, well, I was reading a few days ago that the rail strikes alone, UK hospitality are really concerned that it might cost the hospitality sector alone over this coming week about £500 million, which, you know, is going to have an impact for people working in the industry, especially after the industry's had a really, really rough couple of years because of the pandemic. So watch this space. Let us know. Get in contact with us. How do you feel the rail strikes are going to impact you? If you've got exams coming up, medical appointments, let us know. Email us on gbviews@gbnews.uk.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, my Mark Meets guest is troubled football genius Jermaine Pennant. Hear his incredible story of recovery and redemption at 10. We'll be celebrating Father's Day, so send in pictures of your dad to mark@gbnews.uk. And that's the topic of our big question this evening. Do dads still matter? And in my big opinion, David Beckham's World Cup hypocrisy, and why Nicola Sturgeon will never take Scotland out of the UK. See you at 9.
Now, the government has approved the extradition of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States, where he faces espionage charges. Assange is wanted in the US over an alleged conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defence information. That's after his company published hundreds of thousands of leaked documents relating to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Assange's legal team have said they'll be appealing the decision, and in a statement, WikiLeaks said that this is only the beginning of a new legal battle. Paul, this is a story that's particularly kind of piqued your interest. What do you make of the extradition order?
I think it's an appalling decision, Deanna. I think it's an indefensible decision. Julian Assange, who I have to say I don't particularly like as an individual, but his only crime was to release information that embarrassed the US government and that exposed some of the wrongdoing that the US was guilty of in Iraq and Afghanistan, and exposed some of the appalling behaviour that was taking place inside of Guantanamo Bay. I don't think there's any serious evidence to suggest that the information he leaked put any lives in danger. So it seems to me that this is a political extradition, and one that I think will potentially have a chilling effect on freedom of expression and investigative journalism, because frankly, if you were an investigative journalist who did come by information, the like of which Julian Assange came by, then probably, having watched this story develop, you would think twice about publishing that information. And that's a situation I don't think we should ever find ourselves in. And what I found bitterly ironic, actually, was that the decision by Priti Patel to approve Assange's extradition came on the same day as the 50th anniversary of Watergate. Now, Watergate was, I think, one of the examples of great investigative journalism doing its job properly and doing its job well. So I can't see in any way how Priti Patel can defend this decision. I think there's a wider debate to be had about the US-UK extradition treaty, which I think is fundamentally unbalanced and seems to work far more in the favour of America than it does the UK. But the idea that America can just reach in to Britain and extradite someone, even when what that person has done does not necessarily constitute a crime under UK law, I think is deeply, deeply disturbing. And I would like to see members of the media who have got an interest in this coming out more forcefully and standing against it.
Arlene, do you share Paul's analysis there?
Well, I share some of it. I do think that it's time to look at the treaty again. And David Davis has been saying that there's a need to make sure that there's equity between what happens both ways. I think that's important. But I probably do disagree with Paul in relation to Priti Patel, because it appears that she had little option but to approve what the court had decided back in April. She had just 2 months to approve that. And there was very little room for manoeuvre. I mean, it'll be set out very clearly as to how she can disagree with the court, and she will have been given advice on that. And I would imagine there was very little discretion. So we can argue about the fact of whether he should be extradited or not. But on the process point, I would imagine that Priti Patel had very little room for manoeuvre.
Well, joining us now to discuss this story further is human rights lawyer David Haig. Can you just give us a rough timeline from the point of WikiLeaks to here? How has it all come about?
I mean, it's been a very long time. It's more than a decade, nearly 12 years, I think, that this has been dragging on. Most recently, there was a US extradition attempt to bring Julian Assange to the US. And essentially what happened at the lowest court found that couldn't happen because there was a real risk of various abuses of his human rights. One of those things was essentially a long solitary confinement, which can be found to be a form of torture. That was effectively overturned by the High Court on the basis of various assurances that were given by the US to the UK on how it would or wouldn't treat Julian Assange. And then effectively, trying to sum this up quite quickly, the Supreme Court would not permit appeals by Julian Assange and his legal team. So that then meant that the Home Secretary, as Arlene, I think, commented on, effectively had something of almost a rubber stamping type exercise, although there was scope that she could have looked into it a little bit further, because there's history of that. I don't know if anyone remembers the case. There was a case of Gary McKinnon. He was a young British hacker some time ago, ironically looking for UFO evidence in America, and managed to hack a significant number of US government computers. In that case, and this was back when Theresa May was the Home Secretary and Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecution, so some time ago, she actually intervened and stopped his extradition to the US on the basis of his Asperger's symptom and mental health. So there is some limited precedent for Priti Patel to step in. So that's effectively where we are. The next stages legally there's effectively two routes. One is, because the decision of Priti Patel is a government one, it can then be reviewed again by the courts through a thing called judicial review. So effectively it goes back to the High Court. And the other is to the European Court of Human Rights.
Assange's family have stated that there will be an appeal here. So you've said there could be two different routes. Which route is it that they're pushing for?
They've indicated they will do both, and I'm sure that they will be doing them both in parallel.
And David, I mean, where do you see this going? I mean, there's not so much past precedent for this particular extradition sends, but if you were a betting man to put your money on it, do you think that the extradition will get blocked or not?
It's an incredibly worrying situation because of the signals that it sends to not just the US, but authoritarian and countries around the world that want to basically control journalists and cover up the truth. So I think it's a very, very significant step as to what happens next. And I think everyone will be watching, obviously, including journalists. It's very, very concerning. I would suspect that he will be sent. However, I think there is uncertainty because we're at a situation where you have a new Bill of Rights coming in, which, according to Dominic Raab, is meant to strengthen free speech. Will that be in time? Will it not? We're not sure. Because obviously that will replace the Human Rights Act. So I think it's back to the courts. But what we've got to consider is that the courts have already decided, the High Court have already decided that he could effectively be extradited. So we're now being sent back to them. However, the legal team of Julian Assange have said they will raise effectively new points that they've not considered before, such as focusing more on freedom of speech. So it may be a different outcome. But I think it's incredibly concerning, and it's clear, I think, that it's a political manoeuvre, and that's I think that's something that's very, very worrying.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, thank you for your insights this morning. David Haig, their human rights lawyer, commenting on the recent news that Julian Assange is due to be extradited. Now, this week, Nicola Sturgeon unveiled what she called a refreshed case for Scottish independence. During a press conference in Edinburgh, Scotland's First Minister said her government had an indisputable mandate for a second independence referendum, as she launched the first of a series of papers setting out the case to break away from the UK. Opposition parties have accused the Scottish Government of being obsessed with independence, and Boris Johnson has said the 2014 referendum result should be respected. Well, to discuss Scottish independence further, we're delighted to say we're now joined by a political pundit and Managing Director of East Points West, James Melville. James, thank you for joining us this morning. What do you make of Nicola Sturgeon's announcement on this consultative referendum?
I welcome it, actually. I mean, I've got issues with how the Scottish Government have approached COVID, but that's a very, very different issue to actually independence. My view is that Scotland has a democratic deficit right now, which has been going on for a long time. The Tory government hasn't won a national election in Scotland for over 65 years, and Brexit is happening against the will of the Scottish people. And it's a bit rich for Boris Johnson to say you can't have another referendum, considering circumstances have changed a lot since the last one 8 years ago. I'm a believer in democracy, and I'm a believer that Scottish people should be deciding their own fate, whether that is for independence or not. And I think the time is now right for another independence referendum, 8 years on from the last one.
And James, looking at the current polling, I mean, it fluctuates. It's seemingly week to week and month to month. But I think the most recent polling I've seen has shown that there's actually a slight majority in favour of remaining part of the UK. Would that concern you if there was a second referendum?
Well, that's up to the Scottish people to decide. I mean, if you look at the last time in 2014, the Yes campaign started at quite a low base and then it tightened towards the actual referendum. You know, that's up to the Scottish people to decide. I think there now has to be a conversation about another referendum, which is what Sturgeon's doing. I think she does have a mandate for it if you combine, in terms of total seats, the SNP and the Greens within the Scottish Parliament. And I think basically 8 years on, considering there is that deficit of democracy in Scotland, as I touched on, it's up to the Scottish people to decide. And if they go for independence, that's up to them. If they don't, then that will actually settle it, I think, for another generation. But considering circumstances have changed a lot in Scotland over the last 8 years, I think it's time for the Scottish people to decide.
Mm. And so if there was this consultative referendum, James, my understanding is that it wouldn't kind of be legally enforceable in the same way as a main referendum, but it would actually then empower the Scottish Government to embark on independence talks with the UK. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one. You end up in a situation what's happened with Catalonia and Spain. That's the absurdity of the whole thing. You know, Scotland's having to go cap in hand again with the Scottish Government and the British Government squabbling over whether they can have another referendum. Johnson, if he's a true believer in democracy that he claims to be, should be granting that. But it's a ludicrous state of affairs that effectively the final decision on a verified referendum is with the British government. That's part of the whole problem of the debate. If it isn't given and granted by the British government, then there is a danger that you could end up having, say, the unionist side of the debate boycotting the actual referendum. I think what we need to do is a bit of grown-up politics here and actually adhere to the very principles of the will of the people and democracy. The first stage on a referendum should be a legitimate referendum, and then it's up to the Scottish people to decide from that.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking dry and clear for many, but there could be a few showers in southern England. Let's take a look at the details. It will be cloudy to end the day across southwest England. There could be spots of rain as showers push in from the Channel. Skies will also be cloudy to end the day in southeast England. There could be spots of light rain here and there, but it should stay dry for most. It should also be a dry end to the day in Wales with largely clear skies here. It will turn chilly after the sun sets.